All right, today we're going to talk about political power and territoriality. So these are concepts that are essentially looking at the political map and thinking about some of the historical and current processes that sort of shape what we see on it. So it's going to be thinking about things like colonialism and the sort of post-colonial creation of lots of new states, as well as the creation of new states after the end of the Cold War, as well as some sort of modern contemporary trends uh, around kind of what foreign policy and what the political map looks like today. So the first thing we're going to start off with is this big squishy term that you see at the bottom called territoriality. So it's defined in kind of in the course outline as the connection of people, their culture, and their economic systems to the land. So thinking about that in a sort of political science context, it is essentially the sort of connection that a government and its people would have to an individual part of land. So essentially, it occurs when people want to control land and exert their influence over the people that live kind of on the land. And we're thinking in terms of the government. So it's sort of about who controls what, and this can apply to small or large pieces of land. So, like I said, kind of a big squishy topic. I think um, looking at some of the subcategories of territoriality is a little bit more useful. But here you see in kind of this cartoon a recent situation where I think the idea of territoriality would come into play. So you have this former part of the Ukraine called Crimea that essentially was previously part of the Soviet Union, and within the last 5 years, I think a few years ago, there was a sort of Russian invasion of Crimea based on the fact that they claimed, because under the Soviet Union it had become more ethnically Russian than Ukrainian. And you have kind of ideas of basic territoriality sort of at play here when you're thinking about the connection between individual sort of nationalities and land, as well as sort of a movement towards reclaiming lost land, which sort of leads us to the next concept, which is called Irdentism. So Irdentism is a policy of advocating the restoration of of a country of any territory formerly belonging to it. So we mentioned Crimea and the Ukraine and Russia and the sort of that example, and that is probably in terms of one of the most recent examples, a really good one. Like I said, the kind of Russian invasion was sort of the pretext for it was that many people who were ethnically Russian lived there from the time in which the Soviet Union controlled that part of the world, or that part of the Ukraine was in the Soviet Union. So you have some other examples of sort of modern irredentist claims. So Israel and Palestine, you have sort of competing claims back and forth historically, but kind of in modern times you have many Palestinian claims of sort of attempting to reclaim lost territory kind of within Israel. You have similar issues related to parts of Georgia that are, were part of the Soviet Union and are still sort of in this interesting Shatterbelt that is in between in the Caucasus, in between Russia and Georgia, and kind of parts of the country that are being encouraged strongly to rejoin Russia. So you have interesting kind of irredentist uh, activities going on kind of all along the border of Russia, essentially. And similarly with China, you have lots of claims. A lot of their claims are towards specific islands and having some sort of maritime claims as well. So I have a few other examples here, and then in this map you can see this is this is a vodka ad, but it's an interesting, I think, connection to irredentism. I guess this was an ad in Mexico, but essentially the you can see the land that was lost in the 1840s and 1850s from the country of Mexico, which comprises most of the western United States. So I guess that would be considered irredentism as well. All right, so the third term that I want to introduce is a concept that we mentioned a little bit before called a Shatterbelt. So a Shatterbelt is a region that's caught between stronger colliding external cultural and political forces. So it's a lot in definition. But essentially, the way that I think of the term Shatterbelt is it is sort of an area of kind of constant conflict, and oftentimes it is a kind of a part of a larger conflict. or kind of the way to think of it is there are sort of larger powers at play. So for instance, you have some examples here, Eastern Europe. In the middle, that was frequently, the source of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union at the time. You have kind of since then the breakup of Yugoslavia and many of the kind of violent creations of new states in that part of the world. Similarly, you have in the map on the right this region of the Caucasus that we talked about before. And currently, you have kind of a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and a lot of activity in the north between Russia and Georgia. And like I said, all sorts of interesting kind of geopolitical parts of the country that are encouraged to break away, and you have kind of interesting politics here too. So the Caucasus and Eastern Europe are considered to be kind of the former Yugoslavian part of that you see in the box here. They are two good examples of Shatterbelt regions. A few other ones that are you commonly see East Asia, kind of in a more historical sense at this point. But you had as kind of a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union and China, kind of within the 20th century, places like Vietnam and Korea. So those would be considered Shatterbelts as well. All right. And I also kind of think the term Shatterbelt has sort of oftentimes a connotation of having lots of sort of smaller ethnicities or smaller nationalities or smaller groups of people. It's not necessarily always the case, but that has in most of the places seem to have that in common as well. Okay, so we just went through some vocabulary. The last thing I want to do is talk about some of the reasons why new states were created in the late 20th century. So essentially, I want to kind of give two big reasons and talk about the two big reasons. So the first one we mentioned is you had kind of throughout the 20th century, you had the Soviet Union, which comprised 15 different modern day countries. So most notably Russia, that's kind of what we think of when we think of Russia. But if you compare a map of Russia to the Soviet Union, which existed for most of the 20th century, you will find the Soviet Union is much bigger and contains lots and lots and lots of other countries. So the countries on the right, kind of these Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan are 5 other countries that were part of the Soviet Union, along with countries kind of in the Caucasus, like Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as countries in Eastern Europe as well, places like the Ukraine and Belarus, and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. So kind of following the breakup of the Soviet Union, starting in the late 1980s and then the early 1990s, you had the creation of lots and lots and lots of new states kind of formally out of the USSR. And similarly, all of the countries that you see on the left during kind of the second half of the 20th century were called Yugoslavia, and they were basically one country. So Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, and Macedonia. And those have split off and become 7 independent countries, kind of in the 1990s and in the 2000s. So you have, again, kind of the creation of new states out of formerly communist, much larger communist states. And also the breakup of Czechoslovakia into kind of its 2 component parts of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. All right, so that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is the independence of former European colonies, kind of in the post-colonial period. So this is a trend that started after World War II, where you saw countries like the United Kingdom and France, and Portugal and Spain start to relinquish many of their former colonies for economic and political reasons. You see a lot of different new countries created in the post, kind of including just about every country in Africa, kind of post 1950 or so. Kind of some of the more recent examples of countries that have been kind of carved out of post-colonial space are you see here. So not all of these are in Africa, but some of them are. South Sudan, Namibia, Cape Verde, Djibouti, some of those, Eritrea, some of those examples are in Africa. And we're about to do an activity where you're going to kind of examine the effect of the colonial borders on kind of the modern political landscape of Africa. Okay, thanks. Bye.